Welcome to Sapiens Sleep Stories. If you're here tonight, you're likely searching for rest, seeking to quiet the mind and drift gently toward the sleep that feels just beyond reach. Tonight, we're exploring something profound, something that challenges what we thought we knew about human history. Why Homo sapiens outlived Neanderthals when both species were intelligent, capable, and successful for hundreds of thousands of years. Not through violence or dramatic superiority, but through subtle advantages, small differences that accumulated across millennia until they transformed into survival for one lineage and extinction for another. It's a question that reveals the complex mathematics of human success, especially when we consider that Neanderthals thrived for over 300,000 years, survived ice ages, developed sophisticated tools, yet gradually disappeared while Homo sapiens expanded across the entire world. How could our direct ancestors succeed where their closest relatives failed? What advantages did larger social networks provide that isolation could not? We'll discover the power of connections spanning hundreds of individuals rather than dozens, the safety of throwing spears, striking from 100 feet rather than 10, the efficiency of complex vocal communication enabling better coordination and teaching, the flexibility of rapid innovation and adaptation, and the honest truth about what made Homo sapiens successful, not through any single superiority, but through specific combinations of capabilities that compounded across thousands of years. If you drift off while listening, that's exactly what should happen. Consider subscribing if these stories help you find rest. And there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description if you'd like to support this channel. A like helps others discover these sleep stories too. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when two human species walked the same earth, hunted the same animals, faced the same challenges, and discover through their story what makes populations successful across deep time, and what we can learn from comparing the people we descended from with the people who gradually disappeared into the fossil record. Two human species walk the same earth, breathe the same cold air, hunt the same animals across landscapes of grass and stone. Both possess intelligence, both craft tools, both understand fire and shelter, and the rhythms of seasons turning. Both bury their dead with care, both paint their bodies, both look up at stars wheeling overhead through winter nights. For tens of thousands of years, they occupy territories that sometimes overlap, sometimes remain separate. Two branches of humanity existing in a world that offers no guarantee to either. One species will continue forward through time, carrying its particular patterns of thought and social connection into an uncertain future. The other will gradually disappear, its last individuals living and dying until no more remain, until only bones and artifacts speak of a people who once thrived for hundreds of thousands of years across landscapes from Western Europe to the edges of Central Asia. This is not a story of conquest or warfare, not a tale of superior defeating inferior, but rather an exploration of subtle differences, small advantages that accumulate across thousands of years until they transform into survival for one lineage and extinction for another. The question that guides this long night's journey through time is simple in its asking, but complex in its answering. Why did Homo sapiens outlive Neanderthals when both species were intelligent, capable, and successful for so long? The answer unfolds not in a single dramatic moment, but in countless small scenes across millennia, in the way groups connect with distant neighbors, in the distances from which weapons strike their targets, in the complexity of sounds that flow from throats into cold air, in the speed with which innovation spread through networks of bands and families scattered across continents. Two species, one world, and the subtle mathematics of survival playing out in ways that neither could have predicted or controlled. leading eventually to a world where only one human species remains, carrying forward a mixture of advantages that proved decisive, not through any single superiority, but through their combined effect across the vast span of deep time. The world they share stretches across vast territories where winter cold penetrates deep into the earth and summer warmth brings brief abundance before the cycle turns again toward darkness and scarcity. In river valleys where water flows year-round, both species establish temporary camps, building shelters from branches and hides, arranging hearths where fires burn through long nights, creating spaces where families gather and children grow, and the work of survival continues generation after generation. On open plains where grasses wave in endless wind and herds of horses and bison move in seasonal patterns following the growth of vegetation, both species track these animals, understanding their movements, anticipating where they will appear, planning hunts that require knowledge passed down from experienced hunters to young people learning the skills that will sustain them throughout their lives. In forested valleys where trees provide shelter from wind and wood for fuel and materials for tool manufacture, both species make use of these resources, selecting appropriate branches for spear shafts, finding stones suitable for shaping into cutting edges, gathering plant materials for cordage and bedding, and the countless small necessities that daily life requires. The physical evidence of their presence appears in archaeological layers where careful excavation reveals the remains of hearths, the scattered bones of butchered animals, the stone tools abandoned or lost during the process of tool manufacture and use, the traces of structures where posts once stood supporting roofs of hide and vegetation, all speaking of human intelligence, human planning, human social life organized around the fundamental needs that every population must meet to persist across time. Both species face the same challenges that Ice Age environments present to human populations. The need to maintain body temperature in climates where cold can kill within hours if shelter and fire fail. The need to obtain sufficient calories from landscapes where resources vary dramatically between seasons and across years depending on climate patterns that remain unpredictable from any single individual's perspective. The need to avoid or defend against predators, including large carnivores like cave lions and cave bears and wolves that compete with humans for the same prey animals and that view humans themselves as potential meals when opportunities arise. The need to heal from injuries and illnesses that can disable or kill if not properly treated with the knowledge and care that experienced community members possess, and the need to raise children through the extended period of dependency that characterizes human development, keeping young people alive and healthy until they acquire the skills necessary to contribute to group survival and eventually to raise their own offspring successfully. Neither species finds these challenges easy or simple. Both lose individuals to cold exposure, to hunting accidents, to predator attacks, to illnesses that spread through groups, to injuries that become infected or that prove too severe for healing, to the countless dangers that accompany existence in environments where small mistakes or bad fortune can have fatal consequences. Both species succeed well enough to maintain populations across vast territories for thousands of years, demonstrating through their persistence that they possess the biological capabilities, the cognitive skills, the social organization, and the cultural knowledge necessary for survival in conditions that eliminate most other large mammal species attempting to occupy similar ecological niches in similar environments during similar time periods. Yet despite these similarities, despite the fundamental likeness between two species that share common ancestors and that remain close enough in their evolutionary relationship to interbreed and produce offspring who themselves reproduce successfully, subtle differences exist between them in how they organize their social lives, in how they communicate complex information, in what technologies they develop for hunting and other subsistence activities, in how quickly they generate and adopt innovations, in how rapidly they adapt to changed environmental conditions, in how effectively they transmit cultural knowledge across generations. Differences that seem minor when viewed in isolation, but that combine in ways that create measurably different outcomes when sustained across hundreds of generations spanning tens of thousands of years. Small percentage advantages in survival rates and reproductive success compounding through the mathematics of population growth, until initially similar population sizes diverge into dramatically different trajectories. One species expanding its range and increasing its numbers, while the other contracts its territory and declines in population density, the process unfolding gradually across millennia without any single moment when the outcome becomes obvious or inevitable, simply the slow working of accumulated advantages, creating pressures that shift demographic balances in ways that favor one solution to the problem of being human over another solution that works successfully for hundreds of thousands of years before encountering competition from a lineage with slightly different approaches to social organization, communication, technology, and adaptation. Across the landscape, groups of people move and settle, hunt and gather, their territories marked not by walls or borders, but by familiarity, by knowledge of where water flows and where game animals pass through seasonal migrations, by recognition of landmarks that identify locations where useful resources can be found in different seasons, by memory of which valleys provide shelter from storms and which ridgelines offer views across territories where the movements of herds can be observed from distances that allow planning rather than requiring immediate reaction. Homo sapiens bands maintain connections that stretch across distances that would take days or weeks to travel on foot. Networks of relationship and alliance linking families who may see each other only once or twice each year during seasonal gatherings at particularly rich resource locations, or during ceremonial occasions that bring together groups from across broad regions, but who nevertheless remember obligations incurred when one group helped another during difficult times, who share information when they meet about where game has been plentiful and where plant foods are ripening and what weather patterns seem to be developing, who maintain bonds that persist across generations. As young people hear stories about allied groups they may not yet have met personally, but who occupy important places in the social landscape that structures their community's relationships. A typical Homo sapiens band consists of perhaps 40 to 50 individuals who live and travel together through much of the year, sharing daily meals around common hearths, cooperating in hunts and gathering expeditions, sleeping in adjacent shelters where the sounds of neighbors moving in the night provide reassurance that others remain nearby and alert to potential dangers, raising children who play together and learn together and form bonds that will structure their social world throughout their lives, caring for sick and injured members whose needs the group absorbs collectively, rather than abandoning those temporarily unable to contribute to subsistence efforts, and making collective decisions about when to move camp and where to travel next, and how to respond to opportunities or threats that emerge from the constantly changing conditions that characterize existence in dynamic environments where nothing remains stable for long. But their social world extends far beyond these immediate companions with whom they share daily experience, reaching outward through networks of kinship and alliance to include 8 or 10 other bands with whom they maintain regular contact despite rarely living in the same locations, creating a broader community of 200 to 300 individuals who recognize mutual obligations, who share a sense of common identity that distinguishes them from more distant groups with whom relations may be neutral or even hostile, who provide each other with information about conditions across territories spanning hundreds of square miles, who offer refuge to allied bands facing temporary difficulties in their own territories, who exchange members through marriage patterns that send young people from their birth groups into allied bands where they establish new family connections that further strengthen the web of relationships binding the regional population together. This extended network functions as an information highway where news and discoveries flow along pathways of kinship and alliance, traveling from band to band as groups encounter each other during seasonal movements or during deliberate visits undertaken specifically to maintain contact with allies whose territories lie beyond the range of casual encounters, with knowledge about resource availability spreading through the network as one group shares information about where they observed mammoth herds moving or where they found particularly productive nut groves, or where they noticed fish concentrations during spawning runs, information that other groups can then use to plan their own subsistence activities or that they pass along to other allies who might benefit from knowing about resources in territories they themselves do not regularly use, but that remain within the range of their extended network. Innovations in tool manufacture or hunting technique or plant processing spread similarly through these networks, with a useful discovery made in one territory appearing in distant locations within a single generation. The knowledge carried by young people who marry into distant groups and bring with them the skills and techniques learned in their childhood bands, by hunting parties who encounter neighbors at shared resource locations and demonstrate new approaches to common problems, by families who visit allies and share stories around fires during brief periods when groups camp near each other, by the constant low-level exchange of information that characterizes social interaction whenever members of allied bands meet and talk and observe each other's activities and absorb without even conscious intention the differences in how others approach familiar tasks. The practical benefits of these extensive networks become apparent during crises when local conditions deteriorate and groups must respond to challenges that threaten their survival because a Homo sapiens band facing resource scarcity in their usual territory can draw on knowledge from their entire network of 200 to 300 connected individuals, learning through their allies about alternative resources available in distant territories, receiving guidance about how to access and process unfamiliar plant foods that remain abundant in regions where their usual resources have become scarce, or even finding temporary refuge with allied bands whose territories have been less affected by whatever climatic or ecological factors have created difficulties in the afflicted group's home range. When unusual weather patterns disrupt the seasonal availability of key resources, when animal populations crash due to disease or predation or climate effects, when plant foods fail to materialize in expected locations due to late frosts or drought or other environmental disturbances, when any of the countless unpredictable challenges that characterize existence in dynamic environments create situations where groups cannot obtain sufficient food using their traditional strategies in their familiar territories. The extensive social networks that Homo sapiens maintain provide multiple options for response, multiple sources of information about what strategies might work under changed conditions, multiple potential refuges where groups can retreat temporarily while conditions in their home territories improve or while they develop new approaches to changed circumstances. Neanderthal groups, equally intelligent and fully capable of sophisticated thought and culture and social organization, arrange their lives differently, their bands typically remaining smaller, usually 20 to 30 individuals who know each other intimately through daily interaction, who cooperate efficiently within their immediate group through deep familiarity with each other's capabilities and preferences, who maintain strong internal cohesion through the intensive social bonds that develop when the same individuals live and work together across entire lifetimes, but who interact less frequently with neighboring bands, who maintain territories that overlap less with those of other groups, who establish and preserve more distinct boundaries between different bands' ranges, who rely more heavily on their own accumulated knowledge and direct experience, rather than drawing extensively on information from broader networks of allied groups scattered across large regions. A typical Neanderthal band operates primarily as a self-contained unit whose members depend on each other for survival and who share knowledge primarily within the group, rather than maintaining extensive communication networks with distant allies. Their social world focused intensely on the immediate companions with whom they hunt and gather and sleep and raise children, their territorial knowledge concentrated in the specific regions where they spend most of their time, their strategies for dealing with challenges drawn primarily from their own experience and from the memories and knowledge of their current group members, rather than from a broader pool of information flowing through extensive alliance networks. This difference in social organization, which might seem like a minor variation in how people choose to arrange their relationships and structure their interactions with neighboring groups, actually creates profound differences in how information flows through populations, determining how quickly useful innovations spread from their points of origin to distant groups who might benefit from adopting them. How much knowledge any particular group can draw upon when facing unfamiliar challenges that their own experience does not prepare them to handle effectively. How much genetic diversity populations maintain through intermarriage between families who might otherwise become too isolated and too closely related. And how communities respond to challenges like resource scarcity or climate shifts that make familiar strategies less effective and that require either adaptation to changed local conditions or movement into new territories where conditions more closely match what groups have experience coping with successfully. When a Homo sapiens band faces difficulty finding food in their usual territories, they can draw on knowledge from their entire network of connected groups spanning perhaps 200 to 300 individuals whose collective experience covers hundreds of square miles and many different microenvironments, learning about alternative resources in locations they themselves may never have visited, but that their allies know intimately, receiving detailed guidance about how to recognize and process unfamiliar foods based on other groups' direct experience with those resources, finding temporary welcome in allied bands' territories where they can sustain themselves while waiting for conditions in their home range to improve, or while developing new strategies better suited to changed circumstances. A Neanderthal band facing similar scarcity must rely more heavily on their own direct experience and the memories of their elders, drawing primarily on what their current 20 to 30 members know from personal observation and what their parents and grandparents taught them about how previous generations dealt with similar challenges, possessing deep knowledge of their own territory, but lacking access to the broader pool of information that characterizes Homo sapiens social networks. Having fewer options for refuge in allied groups' territories because their less extensive alliance networks provide fewer alternative locations where they would be welcome to settle temporarily, needing to solve problems primarily through their own ingenuity and accumulated tradition, rather than being able to draw on innovations and solutions developed by other groups facing similar challenges in different locations. This difference, seemingly small in any single instance of crisis, when both species usually manage to find adequate solutions to immediate challenges using whatever resources and knowledge they possess, accumulates across thousands of such situations spanning thousands of years into a measurable difference in how successfully groups navigate the unpredictable challenges that Ice Age environments present to human communities trying to maintain stable populations across generations, despite constant environmental variability and despite the inevitable fluctuations in resource availability that characterize existence in ecosystems where no 2 years unfold identically, and where long-term climate patterns shift gradually in ways that transform familiar landscapes into unfamiliar ones, requiring new strategies and new knowledge for successful adaptation. The mathematics of connection work systematically in Homo sapiens' favor, not because individual Neanderthals lack intelligence or social capacity or ability to form strong relationships and maintain cooperative groups, but because the structure of their social networks limits the flow of information and innovation in ways that become increasingly significant as climatic conditions shift and familiar patterns of resource availability change, requiring flexibility and access to diverse knowledge that larger, more interconnected networks can provide more readily than smaller, more isolated groups, operating primarily within their own accumulated traditions and directly experienced understanding of their immediate territories. Over spans of thousands of years, during which both species face countless individual challenges and solve countless individual problems and sustain their populations through countless difficult periods. The small advantage that broader networks provide in terms of information access, innovation diffusion, genetic diversity, and mutual support compounds gradually into measurably different outcomes in terms of population stability, territorial range, and demographic resilience, creating one of several factors that collectively shift the long-term mathematics of survival in favor of the species maintaining more extensive social connectivity. The capacity to share complex information becomes crucial when survival depends on coordinating group actions involving multiple participants moving according to planned patterns, teaching intricate skills to younger generations in ways that preserve detailed knowledge across time, transmitting information about landscapes and resources that extends beyond immediate sensory experience to include memory of past conditions and anticipation of future possibilities, explaining causal relationships that connect actions to consequences in ways that allow people to understand not just what works, but why it works, and constructing shared understandings of social relationships and obligations that bind groups together through mutual commitment to norms and expectations that everyone recognizes and respects. Homo sapiens possess vocal anatomy that allows for remarkable flexibility in the sounds they can produce, their larynx positioned lower in the throat, creating a longer vocal tract that enables a wider range of vowel sounds and more precise articulation of consonants compared to species with differently configured vocal apparatus, their descended larynx creating acoustic space where sounds can be modified and shaped in ways that produce the rich phonetic inventories characteristic of human languages, their oral cavity and pharyngeal space working together to generate the subtle distinctions between similar sounds that allow languages to pack enormous amounts of information into relatively brief utterances, their tongue capable of assuming countless different positions that modify airflow in ways that create the varied consonants and vowels that combine into the syllables and words and sentences through which humans transmit everything from simple concrete instructions to abstract philosophical concepts. The specific anatomical arrangement of the Homo sapiens vocal tract, with its descended larynx positioned lower than in other primates and creating a longer pharyngeal space above the vocal cords, enables production of sounds that would be difficult or impossible with differently configured anatomy, particularly the full range of vowels that characterize human speech, including extreme vowels like the high front vowel in words like beat and the high back vowel in words like boot, and the low central vowel in words like father, vowel sounds that require specific tongue positions and specific configurations of the oral cavity that only a descended larynx and lengthened vocal tract can achieve effectively. Vowel distinctions that allow languages to maximize the information-carrying capacity of their sound systems by using vowel quality as a primary means of distinguishing between otherwise similar words, creating phonetic systems rich enough to encode the enormous vocabularies that human languages require for expressing detailed thoughts about complex subjects. The descended larynx comes with trade-offs, including increased risk of choking because the lowered position creates intersection between food passage and air passage that does not exist in species with higher larynx positions, but the communicative advantages apparently outweigh the costs. Since the anatomy persists in modern humans, despite the periodic mortality from choking that this configuration creates, suggesting that natural selection favored communication capacity over reduced choking risk in human evolutionary history. Neanderthals possess fundamentally similar vocal equipment, including the crucial hyoid bone that anchors the muscles involved in vocalization, and that shows identical morphology in Neanderthal fossils compared to modern human hyoid bones, indicating that the basic mechanical apparatus for speech existed in both species and that both were capable of producing articulate sounds rather than being limited to the simple calls and vocalizations that characterize non-human primates. And they carry the same genetic marker known as FOXP2 that plays essential roles in language development and processing in modern humans, and that when mutated in humans causes severe speech and language disorders, the shared FOXP2 variant, suggesting that the genetic foundation for language ability existed in the common ancestor of both species, and that both inherited the neurological prerequisites for linguistic communication. These facts demonstrate conclusively that Neanderthals possessed language, that they communicated with sophisticated symbolic systems involving arbitrary sound meaning associations, that their social worlds included story and ritual and metaphor and all the semantic complexity that characterizes human symbolic thought, that they taught complex skills to their children through verbal instruction, supplemented by demonstration, that they coordinated group activities through linguistic communication, rather than relying solely on gestures or simple calls, and that their cognitive capacity fully supported the kind of abstract thinking and sequential planning that language enables. However, subtle differences in the precise positioning of the larynx along the vertical dimension of the throat, the exact proportions of the vocal tract determining the acoustic space available for sound modification, the specific arrangements of the structures, including the soft palate and tongue root that shape sound as it travels from vocal cords through throat and mouth cavities into open air, and the overall configuration of the supralaryngeal vocal tract determining which sounds can be produced most easily and which sounds require more complex or constrained articulations, may have resulted in Neanderthal speech having somewhat different acoustic properties compared to Homo sapiens speech, differences that would not prevent communication or indicate inferior intelligence, but that might affect the range of possible sounds in their phonetic inventories. The ease with which certain sound distinctions could be maintained consistently across all speaking contexts, and ultimately the information carrying capacity of their spoken language measured in terms of how much meaning could be encoded per unit of speech production. Computer modeling based on reconstructions of Neanderthal vocal tract morphology from fossil skull measurements suggests that they may have produced fewer vowel distinctions than Homo sapiens, perhaps lacking the ability to produce extreme peripheral vowels consistently and reliably. perhaps favoring central vowels and consonant-rich syllable structures, perhaps creating speech that to modern ears might sound somewhat flatter in its prosody, more clipped and direct in its rhythm, less melodically varied in its intonation patterns than the flowing complexity of Homo sapiens vocalization with its rich vowel space and its varied pitch contours and its complex rhythmic patterns that characterize languages spoken by anatomically modern humans. These hypothetical differences in speech capacity, if they existed and if they were significant enough to affect actual linguistic behavior, rather than remaining merely theoretical possibilities suggested by anatomical measurements, would have manifested most significantly in situations where precise verbal instruction matters most for successful transmission of complex cultural knowledge. Teaching younger individuals how to manufacture complex tools that require many careful steps executed in specific sequences with attention to subtle details that distinguish successful techniques from unsuccessful attempts. Explaining why certain approaches work better than others by articulating the causal principles that govern material properties and force dynamics and thermal effects. Coordinating hunting strategies that involve multiple participants moving in carefully timed patterns across difficult terrain while maintaining awareness of each other's positions and responding adaptively to unpredictable animal movements. Transmitting detailed knowledge about plant properties that requires distinguishing between species that appear superficially similar, but that differ in nutritional value or toxicity or preparation requirements. Sharing information about distant territories and the resources they contain in ways that allow listeners to anticipate what they will find and how they should approach utilization of those resources, explaining abstract concepts about time and causation and relationship that allow groups to plan ahead across extended periods and anticipate consequences of present actions, and constructing elaborate narratives about past events or mythological occurrences that encode cultural knowledge in story form, making it memorable and transmissible across generations. More complex vocal communication enables more efficient cultural transmission in all these domains, allowing Homo sapiens groups to pass sophisticated knowledge from experienced individuals to learners more quickly and more completely, because linguistic descriptions can capture nuances and explain relationships that simple demonstration might leave ambiguous, reducing the information loss that inevitably occurs as knowledge passes through generational chains of transmission, where each learner becomes the next generation's teacher, enabling innovations to spread more rapidly through social networks, because verbal descriptions supplemented by demonstrations can communicate not just what to do, but why it works, and what variations might be possible, and what errors to avoid. Information that learners need for successfully reproducing techniques and for adapting them to slightly different circumstances or materials than those present in the original innovation context. If Homo sapiens languages carried slightly more information per utterance compared to Neanderthal languages, if they enabled slightly more precise descriptions of complex processes, if they supported slightly more effective explanation of abstract causal relationships, if they allowed slightly richer encoding of sequential information and conditional logic and hierarchical relationships between concepts, then across thousands of teaching events and thousands of information exchanges spanning thousands of years, this difference in transmission efficiency would result in Homo sapiens communities accumulating knowledge somewhat faster, innovating somewhat more readily, adapting somewhat more quickly to changing conditions, all through the simple mechanism of being able to share complex information slightly more effectively through the medium of spoken language that flows between individuals during teaching moments and social interaction, and across generations as each cohort passes to its successors. The accumulated wisdom of entire networks of connected groups maintained through communication systems sophisticated enough to preserve and transmit detailed knowledge with minimal degradation. The advantage compounds because cultural knowledge builds on itself, with each generation ideally adding to, rather than merely replacing what they received from their predecessors, creating cumulative cultural evolution where the knowledge base expands across time rather than remaining static or cycling through repeated loss and rediscovery of the same solutions to the same problems. And the efficiency of knowledge transmission directly affects whether cumulative culture develops strongly or whether each generation must partially reconstruct their culture from incomplete information received through imperfect transmission channels that lose details with each passage from teacher to student. Homo sapiens, with hypothetically superior vocal communication, enabling higher fidelity cultural transmission, would experience stronger cumulative cultural effects with knowledge bases expanding more reliably across generations, while Neanderthals, if their communication was even slightly less information-rich, might experience more knowledge loss across generations, more need to rediscover solutions that previous generations knew, but that current generations received only partially through transmission channels that lost some proportion of the detailed information, more cultural stability but less cultural accumulation. As innovations appeared, but then sometimes disappeared again when transmission failures prevented their complete preservation across generational transitions. When hunting provides the primary source of protein and fat necessary for human survival in Ice Age environments where plant foods alone cannot supply sufficient calories to support large-brained hominins through cold seasons when vegetation becomes scarce or unavailable, the technology of killing large mammals determines not just success rates in terms of how frequently hunts result in obtaining meat, but also risk levels in terms of how dangerous hunting activities prove for the hunters themselves. Injury frequencies that affect how many hunters remain capable of contributing to future hunts versus how many become temporarily or permanently disabled by trauma sustained during hunting encounters, and the overall caloric efficiency of the entire subsistence strategy measured by comparing the energy and time invested in hunting against the nutritional returns obtained from successful kills. Homo sapiens develop and progressively refine throwing spears, projectile weapons designed to be launched at prey animals from distances of 100 feet or more, weapons whose effectiveness depends on careful attention to multiple design parameters, including shaft length and weight distribution and straightness, and the aerodynamic properties that determine how stable the spear remains during flight and how accurately it can be aimed at moving targets. Projectile weapons that allow hunters to position themselves at distances far enough away that prey animals may not even recognize the presence of humans until multiple spears have already been thrown and have already struck or missed their targets, already wounded animals sufficiently to slow them down and make them vulnerable to follow-up attacks, or already forced entire herds into flight patterns that skilled hunters anticipate and exploit by positioning themselves along likely escape routes where fleeing animals can be targeted again as they pass by positions where hunters wait with additional projectiles ready to launch. The archaeological evidence for Homo sapiens throwing technology appears in multiple forms, including the discovery of throwing spears with carefully shaped stone points attached to wooden shafts using sophisticated hafting techniques involving natural adhesives and binding materials. The identification of spear throwers or atlatls that extend the effective throwing arm length and allow even greater projectile velocities and ranges, the presence at some sites of grooved stones that may have served as weights attached to spear shafts to optimize their ballistic properties, and the analysis of wear patterns on stone points suggesting impact velocities consistent with thrown rather than thrust weapons. all indicating that Homo sapiens invested considerable effort and ingenuity in developing projectile hunting technologies that extended their effective killing range and reduced their need to approach dangerous prey animals at close quarters, where the animal's defensive capabilities posed maximum threat to human hunters. These throwing weapons undergo progressive improvement over time as Homo sapiens experiment with different shaft materials, selecting woods that combine appropriate strength with flexibility and lightweight. Try different point shapes, discovering through trial and error which geometries penetrate most effectively and which remain most durable across multiple uses. Develop more sophisticated hafting techniques that keep points securely attached to shafts even under the considerable stresses of impact, and refine their throwing techniques through practice and through the transmission of skilled technique from experienced hunters to younger individuals learning the complex motor patterns required for accurate projectile launching, creating an upward trajectory of technological sophistication where each generation builds on the innovations of their predecessors and where successful improvements spread through social networks as groups observe and adopt techniques that prove superior to their current methods. Neanderthals continue using thrusting spears throughout their long existence, weapons designed to be held in the hunter's hands and driven directly into prey animals through force generated by the hunter's arm strength and body momentum, spears that work effectively for this purpose, and that successfully provide Neanderthal communities with adequate meat supplies generation after generation, but that require hunters to approach within 10 or 15 feet of their intended prey, close enough to drive the spear point through hide and muscle deep into the animal's body cavity where it can damage vital organs and cause the massive blood loss that leads to rapid death. Distances so close that hunters find themselves well within range of the prey animal's defensive weapons, including the sharp hooves that horses and reindeer and elk use to strike at threats, the curved horns that bison and aurochs employ in defensive and offensive behaviors, the enormous tusks that mammoths can swing with devastating force against anything they perceive as dangerous, and the sheer body mass of large prey species that can trample or crush human hunters who fail to move quickly enough when wounded animals thrash about in their death struggles, or when entire herds panic and stampede through areas where hunters have positioned themselves. The skeletal evidence documenting the different risks associated with these two hunting strategies appears starkly in comparative analysis of Neanderthal versus Homo sapiens fossil remains, with Neanderthal skeletons showing dramatically higher frequencies of healed fractures concentrated particularly in the head region, where facial bones and cranial bones show evidence of impact trauma in the neck and shoulder areas where cervical vertebrae and clavicles reveal old breaks that healed during the individual's lifetime, and in the torso where ribs frequently show evidence of fractures, creating an overall pattern of trauma distribution that paleoanthropologists have compared to injury patterns documented in modern rodeo riders who regularly experience impacts from large, powerful animals at close range when bulls or bucking horses strike riders who have fallen or who remain mounted on animals trying to dislodge them. The comparison to rodeo injuries proves remarkably specific, with Neanderthal trauma patterns matching almost exactly the distribution of injuries that rodeo participants sustain, suggesting that Neanderthal hunters regularly found themselves in situations where large prey animals struck them with hooves or horns or tusks, or where hunters were knocked down and trampled, or where the close quarters nature of their hunting technique put them in positions where even successful attacks resulted in injuries as dying animals thrashed about in their final moments, creating ongoing risks of trauma that accumulated across hunting careers spanning decades, with many individual hunters bearing multiple healed fractures, indicating that they survived numerous separate injury events during their lifetimes of close-range hunting activity. Homo sapiens' skeletal remains, while certainly not entirely free from trauma, given the inherently dangerous nature of Ice Age life, regardless of specific hunting techniques employed, show measurably lower frequencies of the particular pattern of close-range impact injuries that characterize Neanderthal remains, suggesting that their throwing spear technology allowed them to maintain safer distances during most hunting encounters, reducing, though not eliminating, the physical risks of obtaining meat from large, dangerous animals, allowing higher percentages of their hunting population to survive to older ages, where accumulated knowledge and experience could benefit not just their own hunting success, but also the training of younger hunters who learned from veterans who had survived long enough to accumulate decades of practical experience. The difference in injury patterns translates directly into population-level effects because hunters who sustain serious injuries require recovery periods during which they cannot participate in hunts, and during which other group members must support them, creating temporary reductions in the group's hunting capacity and creating additional burdens on productive members who must obtain food not just for themselves and their dependents, but also for injured individuals recovering from trauma, while hunters who die from hunting injuries represent permanent losses of skilled, experienced individuals whose absence reduces the group's overall hunting effectiveness and whose deaths may leave dependent children or elderly relatives without adequate support, creating cascading effects where single deaths sometimes trigger multiple additional deaths as family members lose their primary providers. Over spans of thousands of hunts spanning hundreds of generations, these differences in injury rates and mortality rates accumulate into measurable advantages for Homo sapiens groups who achieve the same or better nutritional outcomes from hunting while losing fewer hunters to death and disability, maintaining larger pools of experienced hunters who can participate in hunts throughout longer portions of their adult lives, avoiding the temporary reductions in hunting capacity that occur when significant percentages of a group's hunters simultaneously recover from injuries sustained in separate hunting incidents, and preserving within their populations more elderly individuals who no longer hunt actively, but who contribute crucial knowledge about hunting strategies and animal behavior and seasonal patterns that benefit younger hunters who listen to and learn from these experienced voices. The mathematical advantage compounds because hunting success depends not just on physical capability, but also on knowledge and experience and strategic thinking that accumulate across years of participation, meaning that populations retaining higher percentages of experienced hunters benefit not just from having more bodies available for hunts, but from having more accumulated wisdom and pattern recognition and strategic sophistication distributed through their hunting population, creating self-reinforcing advantages where better technology leads to lower injury rates, which leads to more experienced hunters, which leads to better hunting success, which leads to better nutrition, which leads to healthier populations, which produce more successful next generations who inherit both the superior technology and the accumulated knowledge of their longer-lived predecessors. The organization of brain tissue matters as much as, or perhaps more than, total brain volume when determining what cognitive tasks a species excels at performing, what kinds of problems individuals solve most readily, what types of information processing happen most efficiently, and what behavioral capacities emerge from the underlying neural architecture that determines how different regions of the brain connect with each other, and how computational resources get allocated among competing cognitive demands. Neanderthals possess brains that in total volume average slightly larger than those of Homo sapiens, their cranial capacities measuring perhaps 1,500 cubic centimeters compared to the 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters typical of anatomically modern human skulls. And this larger average brain size does not indicate cognitive superiority or inferior intelligence in either direction, but rather reflects the general biological principle that brain size correlates roughly with overall body mass, with Neanderthals' somewhat larger brains matching their somewhat more robust skeletal structure, their heavier musculature, their stockier body proportions that represent adaptations to cold climates, where compact body forms with reduced surface area to volume ratios help conserve metabolic heat, their overall morphology requiring somewhat more neural tissue to control compared to the lighter, more gracile skeletal and muscular systems of Homo sapiens, whose evolutionary development occurred in warmer African environments where heat dissipation rather than heat conservation drove selection on body form, and where taller, leaner body proportions provided advantages for thermoregulation under conditions of high ambient temperatures and intense solar radiation. What matters for understanding cognitive differences between the two species is not the absolute volume of neural tissue each possessed, but rather how that tissue was internally organized, how the total cranial capacity was distributed among different functional regions that handle different aspects of information processing and behavioral control, and what this differential allocation of neural resources reveals about which cognitive capabilities each species' brain was particularly well equipped to support. Careful studies of skull shape, using both direct measurements of fossil crania and sophisticated computer modeling techniques that estimate brain morphology from the internal contours of skulls, suggest that Homo sapiens brains allocate proportionally more tissue to frontal regions, particularly the prefrontal cortex, the portion of the frontal lobe that lies anterior to the motor and premotor areas, and that plays crucial roles in executive functions, including planning ahead across extended time periods rather than responding only to immediate circumstances, maintaining multiple possible scenarios simultaneously in working memory while evaluating their relative probabilities and likely outcomes, engaging in abstract reasoning that moves beyond concrete situations to consider general principles and underlying relationships between concepts, inhibiting prepotent responses that might be immediately rewarding but that would interfere with longer-term goals, and managing complex social interactions that require keeping track of who knows what information, who owes obligations to whom, what alliances exist among multiple individuals within and between groups, what strategies might prove effective in negotiating group decisions when individuals hold conflicting preferences, and what behaviors will be judged acceptable versus unacceptable given the norms that regulate social life within the community. The prefrontal cortex in modern humans accounts for roughly 30% of total cortical volume, a proportion that appears to exceed that found in other primates, and that may also have exceeded the prefrontal proportion in Neanderthal brains, based on measurements suggesting that the anterior portions of Neanderthal skulls contained relatively less volume compared to the more posterior portions. Though the fossil evidence remains somewhat ambiguous and different researchers interpret the cranial morphology somewhat differently, with some studies suggesting clear differences in frontal lobe proportions, while others argue that apparent differences might reflect measurement difficulties or individual variation rather than species-level distinctions. Regardless of the precise magnitude of any frontal lobe differences, the overall shape of Neanderthal skulls, with their more elongated front-to-back dimensions and their somewhat flattened frontal regions, suggests a brain morphology somewhat different from the more globular Homo sapiens skull shape, with its expanded frontal and parietal regions, differences in gross brain shape that almost certainly corresponded to differences in how neural tissue was distributed among various functional regions, even if the exact mapping between skull shape and internal brain organization remains uncertain, given that soft tissue does not fossilize, and that the relationship between skull form and brain morphology involves complexities that make precise reconstruction challenging. Neanderthal brains, conversely, appear based on skull measurements to have allocated proportionally more tissue to posterior regions, including occipital areas involved in visual processing and parietal areas involved in sensory-motor integration and spatial cognition, and to have possessed larger cerebellums based on measurements of the posterior cranial fossa, the region at the skull base where the cerebellum sits. These posterior emphases suggesting brains organized to support particularly effective visual processing, including depth perception and motion detection and object recognition, in the often dim lighting conditions characteristic of Ice Age environments where overcast skies and long winter nights created chronic low-light situations requiring maximum visual sensitivity. Precise motor control, particularly the fine-grained coordination between vision and hand movements necessary for manufacturing complex stone tools through controlled flaking that requires striking cores at exact angles with carefully calibrated force, and the robust control of their powerful, heavily muscled bodies during physically demanding activities like close-range hunting with thrusting spears that required excellent timing and spatial judgment and full-body coordination to be executed successfully without resulting in injury from defensive prey animals. These differences in brain organization between the two species do not create simple hierarchies where one species can be judged more intelligent than the other in any absolute sense, but rather reflect different evolutionary solutions that prioritize different cognitive and behavioral capabilities, different balances between competing neural demands given that brain tissue is metabolically expensive and that every organism faces constraints on total energy available for maintaining neural tissue, different optimization strategies that matched each species' particular ecological niche and behavioral repertoire, and the specific challenges that dominated their survival problems over the hundreds of thousands of years during which their neural architecture evolved under selection pressures that favored different mixes of cognitive capabilities. Homo sapiens brains, with their expanded frontal cortex supporting enhanced executive functions and social cognition, appear better equipped for the kinds of forward planning that extended social networks require, because maintaining relationships with hundreds of individuals, many of whom are encountered only occasionally, demands keeping track of complex social information across time. The abstract reasoning that enables them to envision distant futures and plan multi-step projects that will only pay off after extended periods of effort. The working memory capacity necessary for simultaneously considering multiple possible strategies while evaluating their likely outcomes before committing to particular courses of action, and the social cognitive abilities that allow them to understand others' mental states and intentions and knowledge, to predict how others will respond to different approaches, to negotiate and persuade and cooperate within complex social systems where success requires sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and interpersonal relationships. Neanderthal brains, with their larger posterior regions supporting enhanced visual motor processing, appear better equipped for the kinds of perceptual judgment and motor control that close-range hunting demands, because approaching large, dangerous prey animals to within thrusting distance requires excellent depth perception for judging exactly when to strike, precise timing for coordinating body movements with prey movements during rapidly evolving close-quarters encounters, rapid reaction times for responding to unexpected animal movements or for avoiding defensive strikes from prey fighting for their lives, and robust control of powerful bodies executing forceful movements under high-stress conditions, where mistakes can result in serious injury or death. Their brain organization optimized for visual motor integration and cerebellar functions supporting coordinated movement through space may have made them particularly effective at the specific cognitive and behavioral demands of their close-range hunting technique, and their robust lifestyle, requiring constant, precise physical interaction with demanding environments, while potentially leaving them somewhat less well-equipped for the kinds of abstract planning and extensive social cognition that Homo sapiens excelled at given their different neural architecture, allocating more resources to frontal regions supporting those particular capabilities. The rate at which new tool forms appear in the archaeological record, the speed with which novel techniques spread through populations occupying large territories, the frequency with which groups experiment with different approaches to familiar problems, and the degree to which populations build cumulatively on previous innovations versus repeatedly rediscovering similar solutions all contribute to a species' overall adaptability in environments where conditions change faster than genetic evolution can produce biological adaptations, making cultural evolution through innovation and knowledge transmission the primary mechanism through which human populations respond to environmental challenges that appear and transform across timescales of decades or centuries rather than the thousands or millions of years required for natural selection to significantly alter gene frequencies. Homo sapiens toolkits demonstrate remarkable dynamism across time when archaeologists examine sequences of occupation layers spanning thousands of years at single sites, or compare assemblages from different time periods across multiple sites within regions, with these temporal sequences revealing relatively rapid changes in blade technologies as new methods of core preparation and flake removal appear and spread through populations, in bone tool forms as needles and awls and barbed harpoon points develop and become more sophisticated in their manufacture and more diverse in their specialized functions, in hunting equipment as projectile points undergo progressive refinement in their aerodynamic properties, and hafting techniques become more secure, and spear throwers appear enabling even greater throwing velocities, and in decorative objects as beads and pendants and ornamental items become more numerous and more varied in their materials and manufacturing techniques, all suggesting populations constantly engaged in experimentation and innovation, frequently trying new approaches to solving familiar problems, regularly adopting innovations that prove useful while discarding techniques that fail to provide advantages worth the effort required to learn and master them, maintaining cultural traditions that value creativity and improvement rather than rigid adherence to ancestral methods, regardless of whether those methods represent optimal solutions to current problems. The archaeological sequences from Homo sapiens sites show tool assemblages changing measurably across periods of just a few thousand years, with new tool types appearing, becoming common, sometimes disappearing again as yet newer innovations replace them, creating dynamic patterns of cultural change where no single technological package remains stable for tens of thousands of years, but rather where each millennium sees modifications and improvements and new approaches being added to the cultural repertoire, even as some older techniques fall out of use when better methods become available, or when changing environmental conditions make different strategies more effective than approaches that worked well under previous circumstances. These patterns of rapid innovation and cultural turnover appear most dramatically in the Upper Paleolithic record associated with Homo sapiens expansion across Eurasia, where archaeological assemblages show marked regional variation and temporal change, compared to the more uniform and stable patterns characteristic of Middle Paleolithic assemblages associated with both Neanderthals and earlier Homo sapiens populations, suggesting that something changed in the rate or effectiveness of cultural innovation and transmission during the period when Homo sapiens were expanding into new territories and encountering new environmental challenges that demanded either behavioral flexibility or rapid innovation to solve problems that their ancestral adaptations had not prepared them to handle. Neanderthal tool traditions, by contrast, display quite remarkable stability across vast spans of time, with the Mousterian toolkit that characterizes Neanderthal material culture remaining essentially unchanged in its basic categories and manufacturing techniques for over 200,000 years, from roughly 300,000 years ago, when recognizable Neanderthal morphology first appears in the fossil record through approximately 40,000 years ago, when the last Neanderthal populations disappeared from their final refuge territories. This enormous temporal stability extending across geographic ranges spanning from Western Europe through Central Europe and into Western Asia and the Middle East, with Mousterian assemblages from sites separated by thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years, showing fundamental similarities in their tool types and manufacturing approaches despite the vast distances and times separating these assemblages. The basic Mousterian toolkit includes several fundamental categories of stone tools produced through prepared core techniques, where cores are carefully shaped before flakes are struck off, with these flakes then being retouched through additional careful flaking around their edges to create points and scrapers and various cutting and piercing tools, techniques that Neanderthals clearly mastered to high levels of sophistication, as evidenced by the quality and consistency of their tool manufacture, but techniques that nevertheless remain recognizably similar across the entire span of Neanderthal existence without undergoing the kind of rapid transformation and diversification that characterizes Homo sapiens tool sequences. This remarkable technological conservatism across Neanderthals' long history does not necessarily indicate lack of intelligence or creativity or inability to innovate, since the Mousterian toolkit clearly worked effectively for their purposes, as evidenced by Neanderthals' successful occupation of diverse environments across vast territories for hundreds of thousands of years, but rather suggests something about the social and cognitive mechanisms that generate and transmit innovations through populations. With Homo sapiens' more extensive social networks and more sophisticated communication systems apparently creating more effective channels for innovation spread, more opportunities for novel techniques to be observed and copied by individuals from groups where the innovation originated, more tolerance for experimentation and departure from traditional methods, and more social reward for individuals who demonstrate creativity and develop useful improvements to existing techniques. The stability of Neanderthal technology might even reflect a kind of achievement, a toolkit so well adapted to their hunting techniques and processing needs and so effectively integrated into their overall subsistence strategy that further innovation offered few advantages worth pursuing, their successful and time-tested methods being transmitted faithfully across generations because they worked reliably and consistently, and because the close-knit nature of their social groups meant that traditional methods were strongly reinforced through intensive social learning from experienced craftspeople who taught younger learners exactly how things should be done according to established practices that had proven their worth across countless previous generations. However, this same technological conservatism that reflected successful adaptation to stable conditions became potential liability when environmental conditions changed dramatically, when climate shifts transformed familiar landscapes in ways that made traditional approaches less effective, when previously reliable resources became scarce, requiring development of new extraction techniques or exploitation of alternative resources that traditional toolkits might not have been optimized for processing, when expansion into new territories with different ecological characteristics demanded modifications to hunting strategies and tool designs to match changed circumstances. Homo sapiens, with their demonstrated capacity for rapid innovation and their apparent willingness to experiment with novel approaches, could respond to such challenges by quickly generating and testing multiple possible solutions, with successful innovations spreading rapidly through their social networks, with detailed verbal descriptions supplementing physical demonstrations to enable more complete transmission of new techniques, with populations developing new tool types and new manufacturing methods within spans of centuries or millennia, rather than requiring tens of thousands of years for new approaches to develop and spread through populations. Neanderthals, more conservative in their technological traditions, more reliant on proven ancestral methods, more invested in specific techniques that worked well in territories and conditions they knew intimately, may have found it more difficult to rapidly generate and adopt innovations when circumstances changed, their slower innovation rates and more limited social networks creating barriers to rapid cultural response when traditional approaches no longer worked as reliably as they had during more stable periods, their populations potentially facing longer transition periods during which they struggled to develop effective responses to changed conditions, while Homo sapiens populations were already implementing and spreading innovations that addressed similar challenges. The efficiency of food acquisition strategies determines how much time and energy groups must invest to obtain sufficient calories to maintain healthy populations, with more efficient hunting and gathering techniques leaving more time for other activities including tool manufacture, social interaction, and cultural transmission, while also reducing the physical demands placed on community members who must provide food for themselves and for dependent children and elderly individuals who cannot contribute equally to subsistence efforts. Homo sapiens develop hunting strategies that emphasize coordination among multiple participants working together to drive animals into disadvantageous positions, using terrain features like cliffs or narrow valleys to concentrate prey, positioning hunters at strategic locations where fleeing animals will pass, deploying their throwing spears from positions that maximize advantage while minimizing risk, approaching hunts as cooperative problems that benefit from planning, communication, and strategic positioning, rather than relying primarily on individual skill and courage in close encounters with dangerous prey. These coordinated group hunting strategies, combined with the safer engagement distances that throwing spears enable, allow Homo sapiens hunting parties to achieve successful kills more consistently while expending less energy in long pursuits, suffering fewer injuries that require recovery time during which injured hunters cannot contribute to group needs, and losing fewer hunters to fatal encounters with defensive prey animals. The net result being that Homo sapiens groups obtain their necessary protein and fat from hunting while investing less total human effort and accepting lower human costs compared to Neanderthal hunting strategies that require closer approaches, more direct confrontation with prey, higher injury rates among hunters, and potentially more energy expenditure in tracking and pursuing animals before getting into position for close-range spear thrusts. The mathematics of caloric efficiency prove crucial for population sustainability over long time periods because the ratio between calories obtained from food and calories expended in obtaining that food determines how much surplus energy remains available for other activities, for supporting pregnant and nursing mothers, for feeding children who will not contribute to food acquisition for many years, for maintaining elderly individuals whose knowledge and experience benefit groups, even though they can no longer hunt or gather as effectively as younger adults. Homo sapiens, obtaining similar or greater caloric returns from hunting while investing less energy and accepting fewer casualties, achieve better efficiency ratios that translate into slightly better nutrition, slightly faster population growth, slightly lower mortality rates. Advantages that seem small in any single generation, but that compound across hundreds of generations into measurable differences in overall population sizes and distribution patterns. The efficiency advantages extend beyond hunting to gathering strategies as well, with Homo sapiens groups showing evidence of using more diverse plant foods, processing difficult-to-prepare resources like underground tubers that require considerable effort to extract and prepare, but that provide reliable calories during seasons when other foods become scarce, and maintaining broader knowledge about which plants provide nutrition in different landscapes, their extensive social networks allowing them to gather information about resource availability across larger territories, to learn from distant groups about productive gathering locations and effective processing techniques, to maintain more comprehensive understanding of how to extract sufficient calories from diverse environments. These gathering efficiency advantages, combined with hunting efficiency improvements, create overall subsistence strategies that provide adequate nutrition with less total effort, leaving Homo sapiens groups with more time for activities other than direct food acquisition, more opportunity for crafting tools and ornaments, more leisure for social interaction and cultural transmission, more capacity to support dependent individuals who contribute knowledge rather than calories, all of which strengthen group cohesion, enhance cultural complexity, improve survival prospects for populations that maintain themselves through combination of direct food production and the maintenance of social and cultural systems that bind groups together and enable effective cooperation across networks of related bands. The size of groups living and traveling together affects almost every aspect of human survival, influencing how effectively communities can defend territories, how successfully they can organize cooperative hunts, how many individuals are available to share knowledge and provide care during illness or injury, and how sustainable populations remain across generations, given the realities of birth rates and mortality rates in Ice Age environments. Homo sapiens characteristically maintain band sizes of 40 to 50 individuals who live together, travel together, and cooperate in daily subsistence activities. This larger group size providing numerous advantages in terms of labor availability, skill diversity, defensive capability against predators or rival groups, and resilience against random fluctuations in birth and death rates that could potentially crash smaller populations through simple bad luck, where several deaths occur within short time periods before enough births have occurred to replace lost members. Neanderthal groups typically remain smaller, archaeological evidence from site sizes and other indicators suggesting bands of 20 to 30 individuals more commonly, this smaller group size reflecting either preference, ecological constraints on how many people could sustain themselves in given territories, given Neanderthal subsistence strategies, or demographic realities, where smaller populations naturally organize into smaller groups. The difference in characteristic group size creates cascading effects across multiple dimensions of survival and reproduction, with larger Homo sapiens bands able to field more hunters simultaneously for coordinated drives and ambush hunts, able to maintain better watch against predators because more adults are available to share guard duties, able to survive the loss of key individuals more readily because more people possess similar skills and knowledge, able to provide better care for sick or injured members because the burden of extra care gets distributed across more caregivers. Smaller Neanderthal groups face greater vulnerability to random demographic fluctuations, with the death of one or two key hunters, or the simultaneous death of several children, potentially creating crises that larger groups could absorb more readily and face greater challenges in mounting large coordinated hunts or defending territories against encroachment by neighboring groups or dangerous predators. The larger group sizes that Homo sapiens maintain also create more opportunities for specialization and skill development, with populations of 40 to 50 individuals likely to include people who excel at different aspects of survival, some becoming particularly skilled at tracking, others at tool manufacture, others at gathering plant foods or at processing hides or at creating clothing. This diversity of skills within groups meaning that Homo sapiens bands carry more total knowledge, can accomplish more different tasks effectively, can respond to more varied challenges because they have members whose particular abilities match different problem types. Smaller Neanderthal groups, while certainly containing skilled individuals, simply have fewer total people and therefore less opportunity for the same degree of specialization, potentially requiring individuals to be more generalist in their skills, able to perform adequately at many tasks rather than excelling at specific ones. The effect compounds through the higher-level networks that connect bands together, because Homo sapiens groups maintaining networks of 8 to 10 allied bands create regional populations of 300 to 400 connected individuals, even though they do not all live together constantly, while Neanderthal groups with their smaller band sizes and more limited intergroup connections might maintain regional networks of only 100 to 150 total connected individuals. The difference in network size meaning that Homo sapiens have access to much larger pools of knowledge, innovation, genetic diversity, and mutual support during crises. Over long time periods, the mathematical advantages of larger group sizes and networks become increasingly apparent in population genetics, with larger Homo sapiens populations maintaining more genetic diversity that provides more variation for natural selection to act upon, avoiding the inbreeding depression that can affect small, isolated populations, producing offspring with better overall health and fitness, sustaining populations through environmental challenges that smaller populations might not survive simply due to reduced genetic variation, limiting their adaptive capacity. The speed with which groups adjust their behaviors and strategies to match changed environmental conditions. The rapidity with which populations develop effective approaches for obtaining resources in unfamiliar landscapes that differ significantly from territories where their ancestral populations lived for countless preceding generations. And the flexibility with which communities modify their subsistence techniques and social organization and settlement patterns to accommodate different climatic regimes, with their associated changes in resource availability and seasonal patterns, all determine how successfully populations can expand into new territories beyond their ancestral ranges or survive through the dramatic climate fluctuations that characterize Ice Age periods when glacial and interglacial cycles create recurring transformations of familiar landscapes into unfamiliar ones, requiring either rapid adaptation or population movements into territories where conditions more closely match what groups have experience managing successfully. Homo sapiens demonstrate quite remarkable adaptive speed throughout their expansion out of Africa and across Eurasia and eventually into Australia and the Americas, with archaeological evidence showing them migrating into entirely new environments with radically different ecological characteristics compared to their ancestral African environments, and establishing sustainable reproducing populations within just a few generations, rather than requiring thousands of years of gradual adjustment before achieving stable occupancy of new territories, moving from African savannas and woodlands characterized by relatively stable warm temperatures and seasonal but predictable rainfall patterns into Middle Eastern environments ranging from Mediterranean forests to arid deserts requiring entirely different water management strategies and entirely different plant and animal exploitation patterns, then into European temperate forests, and eventually into cold steppe environments dominated by very different plant communities and very different animal assemblages compared to African ecosystems, then across into Asian environments ranging from temperate to subarctic zones, each requiring specific adaptations in clothing and shelter and subsistence strategies, each migration into new territory requiring rapid learning about unfamiliar plants to determine which species provide food versus which are toxic, quick adjustment to different animal behaviors and seasonal patterns for successful hunting, immediate development of appropriate shelter construction techniques using whatever materials local environments provide, and fast innovation in tool designs and manufacturing techniques to work with whatever stone types and other raw materials prove available in new territories. Each of these major environmental transitions could potentially have proven impossible to accomplish successfully if populations required many generations of trial and error before developing effective strategies for survival in radically different ecosystems, with failed colonization attempts potentially resulting in local extinctions as populations starved or froze or failed to reproduce successfully in territories where their ancestral adaptations proved inadequate and where they could not generate new solutions quickly enough to prevent demographic collapse. Yet Homo sapiens consistently succeeded in establishing permanent populations in new territories across the full range of environments that Ice Age Eurasia offered, from Mediterranean climates to Arctic conditions, from coastal environments to inland steppe, from forested regions to open grasslands, demonstrating through their successful geographic expansion that they possessed whatever biological capabilities and cultural mechanisms and social organizations enabled rapid behavioral adjustment to changed circumstances without requiring genetic evolution to produce new biological adaptations, matching each new environment encountered. This adaptive speed reflects the combined effect of all the advantages we have been exploring through this long night's journey. Their extensive social networks providing opportunities to gather information from multiple sources about how to approach unfamiliar challenges and enabling populations to draw on the accumulated experience of entire regional networks, rather than relying solely on their own group's direct trial and error. Their superior communication systems allowing detailed verbal transmission of complex technical knowledge about how to recognize useful plants and how to process unfamiliar resources and how to construct appropriate shelters from local materials. Their rapid innovation rates enabling quick generation and testing of new approaches when ancestral techniques prove inadequate in changed circumstances. Their flexible behavioral patterns allowing modification of hunting strategies and gathering priorities and social organization without rigid attachment to traditional methods that might work well in ancestral territories, but that prove less effective in territories with different ecological characteristics, and their generalist morphology, avoiding biological constraints that might limit their ability to function effectively across wide ranges of temperature and humidity and elevation and other environmental parameters that vary dramatically across the geographic ranges into which they successfully expanded. Neanderthals, by contrast, show notably more limited geographic range throughout their long existence spanning over 300,000 years. From their first appearance as recognizably Neanderthal populations, distinguished from their probable ancestors through their derived morphological characteristics, through their final disappearance roughly 40,000 years ago, with their populations remaining concentrated primarily in Europe and Western Asia throughout this enormous time span. Regions where they clearly thrived and successfully maintained populations through multiple glacial and interglacial cycles, demonstrating that they were anything but poorly adapted to their traditional territories, but not expanding significantly into other continental regions, despite having hundreds of thousands of years during which they could potentially have moved into Africa, or into Eastern and Southern Asia, or into any of the other vast territories that remained unoccupied by their populations throughout their existence. This geographic restriction suggesting either that they found it difficult to adapt rapidly to dramatically different environmental conditions compared to the glacial and interglacial cycles they experienced within their traditional European and Western Asian territories, or that their particular combination of biological adaptations and cultural practices and subsistence strategies worked optimally within specific environmental parameters that characterized their traditional range, but that did not translate effectively to other climatic zones with their different assemblages of plant and animal resources and their different seasonal patterns and their different challenges for human survival and reproduction. The difference becomes particularly significant during periods of rapid climate change, when familiar territories transform over decades or centuries as temperatures shift, precipitation patterns change, vegetation communities reorganize, and animal distributions move in response to altered conditions. Situations where populations must either adapt quickly to changed local conditions or migrate to new territories where conditions more closely match their traditional adaptations. Homo sapiens, with their demonstrated ability to adapt within just a few generations to completely unfamiliar environments, appear better equipped to handle rapid environmental change, either through behavioral flexibility that allows them to adjust to changed local conditions, or through migration into new territories where they can establish themselves successfully despite initially alien landscapes and resource distributions. Neanderthals, more specialized for the specific environmental conditions of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, more conservative in their technological and behavioral traditions, potentially face greater difficulties when climate changes force rapid adjustments, their slower innovation rates and more limited social networks potentially restricting their ability to generate and share new strategies quickly enough to match the pace of environmental transformation. Their more isolated groups potentially lacking the demographic resilience to survive through difficult transition periods when traditional strategies work less effectively and new approaches have not yet been perfected. The overall pattern suggests that Homo sapiens possess what ecologists would call greater phenotypic plasticity, the capacity to modify behaviors and strategies in response to environmental conditions without requiring genetic changes, allowing them to respond to environmental challenges within lifetimes rather than across evolutionary timescales. While Neanderthals, though certainly capable of behavioral change and cultural transmission, may have possessed somewhat less plasticity, somewhat more behavioral conservatism, somewhat slower rates of adjustment when conditions changed beyond the range of their traditional adaptations. The transmission of knowledge across generations determines whether populations build continuously on past discoveries or must partially rediscover solutions to problems that ancestors had already solved. The difference between cumulative cultural evolution, where each generation adds to the knowledge base they inherit, and cultural transmission, where each generation receives some, but not all, of what previous generations knew, with inevitable losses occurring as information fails to pass completely from experienced individuals to learners. Homo sapiens demonstrate strong evidence of cumulative culture, their tool technologies showing progressive improvement over time, with innovations building on previous innovations rather than appearing randomly, their regional cultures showing increasing complexity across millennia, with more varied artifact types, more sophisticated manufacturing techniques, more elaborate decorative traditions, all suggesting that knowledge accumulates across generations, with each cohort adding to, rather than simply maintaining what they received from their predecessors. This cultural ratchet effect, where knowledge moves primarily forward with minimal backward slippage, depends on the same factors that provide other advantages. Extensive social networks allowing innovations to spread and be preserved even if they are lost in their place of origin. Sophisticated language, enabling detailed explanation of complex techniques so that learners can reproduce them accurately. Larger group sizes providing more teachers and more opportunities for knowledge transmission. Rapid innovation rates, creating cultures that value novelty and experimentation rather than rigid adherence to tradition. Neanderthals certainly possessed culture, certainly taught their children, certainly maintained technological traditions across millennia, but the relative stability of their tool technologies over hundreds of thousands of years suggests that their cultural transmission might have operated differently, perhaps with less cumulative building on previous innovations, perhaps with more periodic loss of techniques that then had to be rediscovered, perhaps with more conservative transmission, emphasizing faithful reproduction of traditional methods rather than experimentation and improvement. The difference becomes significant when considering how populations respond to challenges, because groups with strong cumulative culture can draw on centuries or millennia of accumulated solutions, tested techniques, refined strategies developed by countless previous generations who faced similar problems and discovered what worked, while groups with weaker cumulative culture must rely more heavily on what current living members know directly from their own experience and what they can remember from their immediate predecessors' teaching. A smaller knowledge base that may not contain solutions to all the challenges that current generations face. Over very long time periods spanning tens of thousands of years, cumulative culture creates accelerating returns, with each generation inheriting a richer toolkit of knowledge and techniques, adding their own discoveries to this growing foundation, passing even more to their children, who then add their own innovations to an ever-expanding cultural repertoire, creating populations whose cultural knowledge grows exponentially even while their biological capabilities remain essentially unchanged. This compounding of cultural knowledge allows Homo sapiens to become increasingly sophisticated in their technologies, increasingly complex in their social organizations, increasingly diverse in their symbolic expressions, all without requiring genetic changes, simply through the mechanism of cultural accumulation, where knowledge builds on knowledge across generations, connected by effective teaching systems, extensive social networks, and communication sophisticated enough to transmit complex information with minimal loss. The cumulative culture advantage becomes particularly important during environmental challenges, when populations must develop new solutions to changed conditions, because groups with deep repositories of accumulated knowledge have more options to draw upon, more combinations to try, more foundation to build from when developing innovative responses. while groups with thinner cultural reservoirs must work harder to generate entirely new solutions from more limited starting points, potentially taking longer to develop effective responses to challenges that require rapid adaptation for populations to survive through transition periods. The spatial organization of populations, the patterns of territory use, and the degree of overlap and connection between neighboring groups all influence how effectively species can maintain themselves across large geographic areas and through fluctuating environmental conditions. Homo sapiens characteristically organize their territorial use around overlapping ranges, where multiple bands maintain claims to the same general regions, with specific core areas where particular bands spend most of their time, but with broader peripheral areas where they overlap with neighboring groups, boundaries remaining fluid and negotiable rather than fixed and defended, allowing bands to shift their ranging patterns when local resources become scarce, or when seasonal changes make different areas more productive, creating territorial systems that function as flexible networks rather than rigid divisions. This overlapping pattern of land use creates multiple advantages for Homo sapiens populations, providing refuge areas where bands facing local difficulties can temporarily shift into territories normally used primarily by allied groups, maintaining regular contact between neighboring bands because their overlapping ranges ensure frequent encounters at shared resource locations like river crossings or seasonal gathering places for particular plants, enabling information flow about resource availability across large regions because groups regularly moving through overlapping territories can observe conditions over wide areas and share this knowledge when they encounter neighbors. Neanderthal territories, by contrast, appear to have been more exclusive, archaeological evidence suggesting more distinct separations between the ranges of different groups, less overlap in the areas where remains and artifacts are found, potentially indicating more rigid territorial boundaries where groups maintained clearer separation from neighbors, ventured less frequently into peripheral areas that might bring them into contact with other bands, defended their core territories more strictly against encroachment by others. The difference in territorial organization creates different patterns of resource access and social connectivity, with Homo sapiens flexible overlapping territories allowing them to draw on larger total land areas, to shift resource use patterns more readily when local conditions deteriorate, to maintain broader awareness of regional conditions through their frequent contact with groups using adjacent and overlapping territories, while Neanderthal more exclusive territories, potentially limiting each group more strictly to their own defined range, requiring them to survive on whatever resources exist within their boundaries, even when those resources become scarce, limiting their knowledge primarily to their own direct observations within their territorial range. The connectivity enabled by overlapping territories proves particularly valuable during environmental stress periods when resource distributions shift. Populations experience food shortages or climate changes force groups to modify their ranging patterns because Homo sapiens' flexible territorial system allows bands to temporarily shift into allied groups' territories, to modify their land use without triggering conflicts, to access refuge areas when their usual territories become unproductive, while Neanderthal, more rigid territorial boundaries might force groups to remain in their established ranges even when conditions deteriorate, might prevent access to alternative resources located in neighboring territories, might create conflicts if resource scarcity forces groups to transgress established boundaries in search of food. Over long time periods, the differences in territorial organization affect population stability and sustainability, with Homo sapiens flexible overlapping systems, providing better buffering against local variation in resource availability, allowing regional populations to persist through challenges that might crash more isolated groups, maintaining networks of connected bands that can support each other through difficult periods, rather than each group facing challenges entirely alone within rigidly defined territorial boundaries. The extended period of childhood dependency that characterizes human development creates opportunities for extensive learning, but also creates challenges for populations that must invest resources in supporting young individuals who will not contribute productionally to group survival for many years. Homo sapiens children appear to undergo somewhat extended learning periods compared to Neanderthal children based on growth patterns visible in fossil remains, with Homo sapiens young people reaching full maturity slightly later, spending more years in developmental stages where they learned skills from adults rather than contributing fully to subsistence activities. This extended childhood allowing more time for knowledge transmission, more opportunity for practice and skill development, more years of guidance from experienced adults who can teach complex techniques gradually rather than requiring rapid mastery. The investment in extended childhood pays returns in the form of more skilled adults who have absorbed more cultural knowledge, mastered more diverse techniques, learned from more teachers across their developmental years, creating populations where average skill levels may be somewhat higher because individuals had more learning time before assuming full adult responsibilities. Neanderthal children, reaching maturity somewhat earlier based on dental development and skeletal growth patterns, spend fewer years in dependent learning stages, begin contributing to group survival at younger ages, achieve physical maturity faster, but potentially with less accumulated cultural knowledge and less diverse skill development because their learning period was compressed. This difference in developmental timing reflects different adaptive strategies, with Homo sapiens investing more heavily in knowledge transmission through extended childhood, accepting the costs of supporting dependent young for longer periods in exchange for the benefits of producing more culturally sophisticated adults, while Neanderthals investing less in extended learning periods, gaining the advantage of having young people contribute productionally earlier, but potentially sacrificing some degree of skill development and cultural transmission depth. The teaching methods used during these learning periods matter as much as their duration. And here, Homo sapiens' advantages in communication and social organization likely enhance learning efficiency, with their more sophisticated language allowing more detailed verbal instruction to supplement physical demonstration, their larger group sizes providing more potential teachers and more opportunities for children to observe and learn from multiple skilled practitioners, their extensive social networks exposing young people to more diverse approaches and techniques as they encounter individuals from allied bands who may do things differently than their immediate family members. These advantages in teaching methods mean that Homo sapiens children may acquire skills somewhat faster despite their extended overall learning period, absorbing more knowledge per year of childhood, reaching adulthood with more diverse capabilities and deeper understanding of the reasoning behind techniques rather than just rote mastery of specific procedures. The long-term effects of differences in childhood length and learning efficiency accumulate across generations in the same way that other cultural transmission advantages compound over time, with Homo sapiens populations gradually accumulating more sophisticated average skill levels, more diverse cultural knowledge, more capacity to solve novel problems because their extended childhoods and efficient teaching methods produce adults who carry more accumulated wisdom forward into each new generation. The dramatic climate fluctuations that characterize Ice Age periods create recurring challenges for human populations as temperatures shift, ice sheets advance and retreat, vegetation zones migrate, and animal populations respond to changing conditions by moving into new ranges or adjusting their seasonal migration patterns. These environmental instabilities test every aspect of human adaptability, requiring flexibility in resource use, adjustment of technology to match changing conditions, modification of settlement patterns as familiar territories become less productive, and sometimes migration into new regions when climate shifts transform familiar landscapes beyond recognition. Homo sapiens demonstrate throughout their expansion across the globe an impressive capacity to weather these climate fluctuations, maintaining populations through cold periods and warm periods, through wet phases and dry phases, through rapid transitions when conditions change faster than individuals' lifetimes, never apparently experiencing population crashes severe enough to drive them to extinction, despite regularly facing environmental conditions that would seem to threaten any species' survival prospects. This climatic resilience reflects all the advantages we have explored through this long night's journey. Their adaptive speed, allowing them to respond quickly when conditions change, their innovation capacity, enabling development of new tools and techniques suited to altered environments, their extensive social networks, allowing regional populations to share information about how to cope with new conditions and providing refuge for groups whose local territories become temporarily unproductive. Their flexible behavior patterns allowing modification of hunting strategies, resource use, and settlement organization without requiring genetic changes. Their efficient subsistence strategies providing surplus that can buffer groups through transition periods when traditional resources become scarce before new strategies have been perfected. Neanderthals, surviving successfully through multiple glacial cycles within their European and Western Asian territories, clearly possessed substantial climatic resilience as well, adapting to repeated shifts between cold glacial conditions and warmer interglacial periods, adjusting their ranging patterns and resource use as environments changed, maintaining populations through challenges that eliminated many other species, demonstrating across hundreds of thousands of years that they were not fragile or poorly adapted, but rather quite successful within their traditional range. However, Neanderthals evolved specifically as cold-adapted specialists. Their robust builds, their stocky proportions, their large nasal passages, all representing biological adaptations to cold environments where conserving body heat provides survival advantages, their entire morphology optimized for the glacial conditions that dominated their territories during much of their existence. This specialization served them well during cold periods when their adaptations matched environmental conditions perfectly, but became potential liability during warm interglacial periods when their cold-adapted biology became mismatched to environmental conditions, requiring them to survive in conditions where their heavy builds and heat-conserving proportions might actually work against them, creating situations where the very adaptations that made them successful during glacial periods became disadvantages during warmer phases. Homo sapiens, by contrast, evolved in African environments where temperature regulation required different solutions. Their taller, leaner builds representing adaptations for heat dissipation rather than heat conservation. Their morphology not specifically optimized for cold, but rather more generalist in thermal adaptation, allowing them to cope adequately in both cold and warm conditions through behavioral adjustments, clothing, and shelter, rather than relying primarily on biological cold adaptations. This difference in biological specialization meant that Homo sapiens could maintain themselves effectively across wider range of climatic conditions without their biology working against them, could expand into both cold and warm regions without facing mismatches between their evolved morphology and environmental conditions? Could weather climate fluctuations that repeatedly shifted conditions from cold to warm and back again without ever facing situations where their biological adaptations became severe disadvantages? During the period when the two species overlapped, climate underwent particularly dramatic fluctuations with rapid shifts between cold stadial periods and warmer interstadial periods occurring over timescales of centuries or even decades, creating conditions where populations needed maximum flexibility to survive through transitions. And here Homo sapiens' advantages in adaptive speed, behavioral flexibility, and morphological generalism proved increasingly valuable, while Neanderthal cold specialization potentially created challenges during warm phases and during rapid transitions when conditions changed faster than populations could adjust their strategies. The disappearance of Neanderthals occurred gradually across thousands of years rather than suddenly through dramatic events, their populations declining slowly as Homo sapiens populations expanded, with the last known Neanderthal remains dating to roughly 40,000 years ago in southern Spain, and possibly as recently as 37,000 years ago in Gibraltar, representing the final holdouts of a species that had thrived successfully for over 300,000 years across vast territories before encountering a species whose combination of advantages proved decisive in competition for the same resources across overlapping territories. The process of replacement did not require violence, did not demand warfare or genocide, did not need dramatic confrontations between the two species, but rather operated through simple mathematics, where Homo sapiens populations sustained slightly higher survival rates, slightly better reproduction success, slightly faster population growth, advantages measured in fractions of percentage points per generation, but compounding across hundreds of generations into measurable population differences that gradually shifted the demographic balance toward the species with accumulated advantages and away from the species facing accumulated disadvantages. Every small advantage we have explored through this long night contributed to this mathematical shift, the larger social networks providing better information flow and demographic stability, the superior communication enabling more effective coordination and cultural transmission, the safer hunting weapons reducing mortality and injury rates among hunters, the more efficient subsistence strategies providing better nutrition with less energy expenditure, the faster innovation rates enabling quicker responses to environmental challenges, the more flexible behaviors allowing adaptation to changing conditions, the larger group sizes providing better resilience against random demographic fluctuations, the extended childhoods creating more skilled adults, the overlapping territories providing better resource access and social connectivity, and the generalist morphology allowing success across wider range of climatic conditions. None of these advantages was individually decisive. None would have guaranteed Homo sapiens success in direct competition. None made Neanderthals inevitable failures, but their combined effect created small, consistent differences in population growth rates that accumulated relentlessly across millennia until Neanderthal populations became smaller, more fragmented, more isolated from each other, less genetically diverse, less demographically stable, entering a downward spiral where declining populations faced increasing difficulties maintaining viable breeding communities, where isolation reduced genetic diversity, leading to inbreeding depression, where smaller populations were less able to weather random demographic fluctuations or environmental challenges, where the loss of individuals to normal mortality created disproportionate impacts on tiny remaining populations. until eventually the last groups disappeared from their final refuges, leaving only bones and artifacts, and the small percentage of their DNA that had entered Homo sapiens populations through brief periods of interbreeding before the two species' evolutionary trajectories diverged permanently. The archaeological record shows this gradual process unfolding across millennia, with Neanderthal sites becoming less common, their territorial range contracting, their populations apparently clustering in increasingly restricted areas, their final remains coming from marginal territories at the edges of their traditional range, rather than from the core areas where they had been most successful, suggesting populations in decline retreating into refuge areas, holding on in less productive territories after being displaced from better regions, eventually disappearing entirely as the mathematics of small population dynamics caught up with groups too small to sustain themselves through random fluctuations in births and deaths, through environmental challenges, through the accumulated effects of reduced genetic diversity and limited social connectivity, not because they were inferior or stupid or incapable, but simply because they faced a competitor whose specific advantages, small though each one was, combined into an insurmountable cumulative disadvantage when sustained across enough generations to allow mathematical probabilities to work their inevitable effects on population sizes and distributions. What we inherit from comparing these two species is not a simple story of superior defeating inferior, but rather a complex understanding of what makes human populations successful across long time periods. The specific combinations of biological capabilities, behavioral flexibility, social organization, cultural transmission, and technological innovation that allow some populations to thrive while others decline when facing competition for limited resources in challenging environments. Neanderthals deserve respect as a highly successful human species that survived and thrived for hundreds of thousands of years longer than Homo sapiens have yet existed, that adapted successfully to some of Earth's most challenging environments, that developed sophisticated tools and maintained complex cultures, that cared for their sick and injured, that buried their dead with apparent ritual, that created art and symbol and meaning in their lives, that were fully human in all the ways that matter for understanding what humanity means beyond simple species classification. They were not primitive, not stupid, not evolutionary failures, but rather a different solution to the problem of being human in Ice Age environments, a solution that worked successfully for enormous spans of time before encountering another solution whose particular combination of advantages proved more sustainable in the long run under the specific conditions of their overlap period. Homo sapiens did not defeat Neanderthals through violence or warfare, but rather through possessing specific advantages in social connectivity, communication sophistication, weapon technology, innovation rate, adaptive speed, behavioral flexibility, group size, cultural transmission, territorial organization, developmental timing, and morphological generalism. Advantages that individually were small, but that collectively created measurably better population growth rates that compounded across thousands of years into species replacement through simple demographic mathematics. What this comparison teaches about human success is that no single factor determines survival, that advantages accumulate across multiple dimensions, that social organization matters as much as technology, that communication enables cultural transmission, that flexibility proves more valuable than specialization when facing changing conditions, that connectivity provides resilience against local challenges, that innovation capacity allows response to novel problems, and that populations maintaining slight advantages across multiple dimensions will eventually outcompete populations that excel in some areas but lack advantages in others. The mathematics of compound growth ensuring that small percentage differences sustained across enough generations transform into large population differences. As we drift toward rest after this long exploration of two human species walking the same earth, hunting the same animals, facing the same ice age challenges, we carry forward understanding that Homo sapiens outlived Neanderthals not through any dramatic superiority, but through possessing particular advantages in social networks spanning hundreds rather than dozens of connected individuals, in vocal anatomy enabling more complex speech for better coordination and teaching, in throwing spears striking from 100 feet rather than thrusting spears requiring 10-foot approaches, in brain organization emphasizing frontal planning and social cognition, in faster innovation rates that produced changing technologies rather than stable traditions spanning millennia, in more efficient hunting strategies, reducing energy costs and injury rates, in larger groups providing better labor pools and demographic stability, in faster adaptation to new environments within generations rather than requiring longer adjustment periods, in cumulative culture-building knowledge across generations, in overlapping territories enabling flexible resource access and information flow, in extended childhoods allowing more learning time and better cultural transmission, in generalist morphology succeeding across varied climates rather than cold specialized biology, and in all these advantages combining across thousands of years of coexistence until the species with accumulated advantages gradually replace the species facing accumulated disadvantages through simple mathematics of population growth sustained across millennia in territories where both needed similar resources, but where one possessed combinations of small advantages that compounded into decisive differences, leading eventually to a world where only one human species remained, carrying forward some small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, but otherwise representing a complete replacement of one solution to being human with another solution whose specific features proved more sustainable under the conditions of their time together on Earth, sharing the same cold landscapes, the same herds of prey, the same need for shelter and warmth and cooperation, until one remained and one disappeared into the fossil record, leaving us to wonder and to understand that what made Homo sapiens successful was not simple superiority, but rather specific combinations of capabilities that matched the challenges of their time and allowed their populations to grow while others declined.